Lesson 13, Learning to use Program Mode. Program Mode on your camera is the setting that's most similar to it is when you're using your phone to take photos with. In Program Mode, the camera controls both the shutter speed and the aperture settings. You can still choose to set your ISO manually, or you can set it to auto. With your camera set to Program Mode, you don't have to control any of the settings of the exposure triangle. You can concentrate on focusing, composing your photos, and timing when you want to take the photo. This does mean that it's easier than having to manage all the settings on your camera, but what is easy is not very often the most creative way of doing things. If you want to use your camera to paint with light in the most creative ways, you are best to learn how to control it manually. I'll introduce how this is done in the next lesson. Program mode is most helpful when the light's changing frequently and you're not yet used to the controls on your camera. This is often on days when there's a lot of small clouds in the sky and the wind's blowing them around so that the sun will be ducking in and out from behind the clouds and the light levels will be changing considerably. It's also helpful in situations where you're photographing somewhere that maybe you're moving from inside to outside and then back again, and so the light levels are changing a lot. Using program mode, though, you do risk problems if you're not paying attention to the settings the camera is choosing. In low light situations, your camera may select a very slow shutter speed. This is okay when you're aware of it, but if you're not looking at the information display in your viewfinder or on the monitor, you may not notice that your shutter speed has dropped to a level that could result in motion or camera shake blur. It's also important to watch your aperture settings. Sometimes you might want to blur the background of a photo. In this situation, you don't want your camera to select a narrow aperture. In bright light, the camera is likely to do this to reduce the amount of light reaching the sensor. Or in very bright light, the camera may choose a narrower aperture and a faster shutter speed, but this will still not result in a blurred background. Some cameras do allow you to override the program mode settings. So if you want to choose a faster shutter speed, you can set this manually, and the camera will still adjust your aperture setting to give a good exposure. You'll need to check your camera manual or do an online search to find out specifically if your camera will do this. I prefer never to use program mode because it gives me no real control over what my exposure is going to be. Program mode is helpful for making the transition from taking photos with your phone to using your camera. If you're in a situation where you're not sure of what exposure settings to use, switch your camera to program mode and let it do that work for you. Focus on your subject, but do look at what the aperture setting and the shutter speed setting the camera is choosing. And then if you want, you can switch your camera over to manual mode and set these settings and experiment with them in manual mode. Practicing like this will help you improve your photography. Lesson 13, Practical Exercise, Learning to use Program Mode. In this exercise, you'll practice using program mode as a means to help you get more familiar with how your camera exposes a photo. You'll be taking some photos of static and moving subjects both indoors and outdoors. Start with your camera set to program mode and your ISO set to 400. Set your subject up indoors to take some photos. Think about how you're holding your camera, or if you need to put it on a tripod, check the shutter speed that the camera is setting. Compose one or two interesting photos. Take a note also of the shutter speed and the aperture that the camera is choosing to use. This will be important to know for the next step of this exercise. Once you've taken your photos inside, take your subject outdoors with your camera still set to program mode. Take some more photos of it. Then set your camera to manual mode. Check your settings that you used for the photos indoors and adjust your shutter speed and your aperture to match the same settings. Either check back at your notes or read the EXIF data from the images on your camera. I'm sure the second set of photos where you've used manual mode and the same settings you used indoors will be very overexposed. This is an important exercise to help you realize the differences in exposure when you're dealing with different amounts of light. Outdoors, there's usually a lot more light than there is indoors, particularly if you're in a darkish room like I was when I took my photos. And now with your camera still set to manual mode, adjust your aperture and your shutter speed so that you get your subject looking the way that you want it to. This may or may not be with the same settings that the camera chose on program mode. Just experiment with the settings to get the exposure looking the way you want it to. How do these photos that you took in manual mode compare to the ones that you took in program mode? The differences will be most interesting when there's a higher level of contrast in the photos. Pay particular attention to the lightest and the darkest parts of each composition and how the tones in these areas appear. This should help you understand your exposure settings and the importance of getting a good exposure. The exposure settings will vary depending on the amount of light. If you're indoors, there won't be as much light as there will be if you're outdoors, particularly on a sunny day. And so the exposure triangle settings must be adjusted accordingly to let the right amount of light into the camera. And the right amount of light does depend a lot on your creative choice. If you're only always on program mode, this is then up to the camera. It's not your creative choice. The camera is just doing what it's programmed to do. So it doesn't always choose the most creative, most interesting exposure. And as you're looking at these photos on your computer, pick 2 or 3 of the best ones and save them to your favorites folder. The main points from this lesson are: program mode allows your camera full control of the exposure. When the light is changing frequently, program mode can help you concentrate on composition and other aspects of taking pictures. When something is easy, the results may not be the most creative. Practice this to improve your photography. Check both your aperture and shutter speed when using program mode to ensure you are happy with the settings your camera has chosen.